the town. They played the Brooklyn Nets. Yeah. Who was Stephen A. sitting next to with his legs crossed? Joe Lacob, okay? That's his partner.
Can I add
and then you have to realize that. Then you have to realize. Hold on. And then you have to realize.
I mean, he's getting a little bit too specific. I mean, that is not true. But I was sitting next to Joe Lacob.
That was a real laugh. My first real laugh all morning. I did a couple of courtesy laughs.
Molly.
The belly one. Thanks, Perk.
He also has a soft spot in his heart for his brother Draymond Green, and God knows we already. No. We already
I had a
know.
soft spot for Steph Curry. I thought you said Steph Curry.
Hold on, I'm about to get to that. We already know. You acknowledged it. That I told you. I said when it comes down to Steph Curry, that's the one player that you don't criticize, and you said I know. And I'm proud of it. So, when you come on here talking about the Warriors, I already know what time it is.
Kendrick Perkins says there was a point when he learned something about Stephen A. Smith that changed the way he looked at him forever. Not on live TV, not during a debate, not in front of cameras. It happened behind the scenes, away from the bright lights, where real power at a place like ESPN is used in quiet ways. According to Perkins, Stephen A. was not just a loud voice on television. He was also a man with major influence inside the building. And Perkins says that at some point, that influence was being used against him. That is the center of this story. Not just two analysts arguing on TV, but one former player saying that one of the biggest names in sports media was trying to push him out. Perkins has made it clear that this was not one small issue that came out of nowhere. In his version of the story, this was years in the making. It was built through private talks, on-air clashes, tense moments after shows, and a slow change in the way he says Stephen A. treated him. In public, the relationship often looked normal. Sometimes it even looked friendly. They sat across from each other, talked basketball, laughed, argued, and played their roles on one of the biggest sports shows in the country. To the audience at home, that can look like a normal media relationship. But Perkins now says that behind all of that, something very different was happening. He says the smile on camera was one thing, and the actions behind closed doors were something else. To really understand why Perkins feels the way he feels now, you have to go back to when he first arrived at ESPN. Back in 2019, Kendrick Perkins was still new to the TV world. He had already won an NBA title, he had already built a name in basketball. But being good on a basketball court and building a media career are two very different things. TV is its own world. It is full of politics, full of timing, full of image, and full of people trying to hold on to their place. Perkins came in hungry. He wanted to prove that he belonged there. He wanted to show that he could do more than just talk like a former player. He wanted to build a second career that mattered. At the start, though, the money and the contract situation did not match what people at home probably assumed. Perkins was not walking into ESPN with some huge full-time deal. He was on what is called a day rate contract. That means you get paid for appearances, not for being a full-time face of the network. According to the story he later told, he was making around $2,500 each time he appeared, and there was a limit on how many days he could work. So even if viewers kept seeing him on big shows, that did not mean he had real long-term security. It did not mean he had a strong deal. It meant he was useful, but still replaceable. It meant he was there, but not fully established. That matters because it helps explain why one later moment seemed so important at the time. Perkins has said that sometime around 2020 or early 2021, Stephen A. Smith wanted him on First Take for a full week during the NBA playoffs. The show liked what Perkins brought. He had energy, he had real player experience, he spoke with force. He could disagree without sounding fake. But the problem was his contract. ESPN told Stephen A. no. They said Perkins could not do the full run because of the limits in the deal he had at the time.
That is where, according to Perkins, Stephen A. stepped in. And for years, this part of the story made Stephen A. look like the guy who helped him. Perkins says Stephen A. called people higher up at the network and pushed for the problem to be fixed. He says Stephen A. told him something like, "You'll hear from the bosses tomorrow." And then, according to Perkins, that is exactly what happened. ESPN came back and changed his whole situation. Instead of keeping him on the small day rate setup, they moved him into a much bigger deal. Perkins says the old contract still had a year left, but it was torn up and replaced with a 3-year contract worth about $700,000 a year. That is life-changing money. That is career-changing security. That is the kind of jump that makes you feel like someone powerful believed in you and opened the door wider. For a long time, it sounds like Perkins believed exactly that. He believed Stephen A. had helped him. He believed Stephen A. had used his power to do something good for him. And if that had been the whole story, maybe none of this would be happening now. Maybe Perkins would still talk about Stephen A. as someone who looked out for him when it mattered most. But that is not how Perkins sees it anymore. The way he tells it now, that big contract was not a simple act of support. It was not a move based on friendship. It was not about helping Perkins because he cared about him as a person. Perkins now says he thinks it was a strategic move, a business move, a power move. That is where this whole story starts to get darker. Because Perkins says he eventually came to believe that Stephen A. wanted him around for a reason, not because he was the best voice on the network, not because Stephen A. thought he was the future of basketball media, but because Perkins fit a role. He was loud, emotional, connected to the game, and at times rough around the edges. He could create moments, he could spark debate, he could say things that got people talking. But according to Perkins' view now, Stephen A. also may have felt like he could control that relationship. He could be the one who helped make Perkins' media career real, and in doing that, maybe he believed he had created someone who would always stay in line. If that is true, then the contract was not just a reward, it was leverage. It was a way of tying Perkins to a structure where Stephen A. remained the bigger power. Perkins has said that for a while things worked that way. He played his part, he came on the shows, he argued his points, he took part in the sports TV machine. Stephen A. stayed at the center of it all. He was the star, he was the main voice, he was the biggest name at the network. And Perkins, like many others, was one of the people around him helping feed The Daily Show. That kind of setup can last for a long time if everybody stays in their lane, but the problem, according to Perkins, came when he stopped staying in the lane Stephen A. may have wanted for him. Over time, their on-air disagreements got sharper. That's normal to a point. Sports TV is built on disagreement. But Perkins says the pattern behind the scenes started to matter more than what people saw in front of the cameras. He says the issue was not just that they argued. He says the issue was what happened after the arguments. That is a major part of his claim. Not that Stephen A. yelled at him on TV, not that Stephen A. challenged him publicly. Those things come with the job. The bigger claim is that Stephen A. would then go to people behind the scenes and talk about Perkins as a problem. That is what makes this story so serious, because if true, it is not just debate.
It is career damage. One of the biggest turning points in the public side of their story came in February of 2023 during that now famous MVP debate with J.J. Redick. The topic was race and MVP voting, and Perkins made a very strong claim. He suggested there was racial bias in the voting history. That was instantly explosive. Redick pushed back hard. The argument got personal fast. It stopped sounding like a calm debate and started sounding like real anger. Redick called out what he believed Perkins was implying. Perkins said he was just stating facts. The whole moment became one of the most talked about ESPN debates in a long time. It spread everywhere. People were picking sides. Some said Perkins crossed the line. Some said Redick overreacted. Some said both men were too heated. What stood out later, though, was not just the debate itself. It was how Perkins said it was handled afterward. He did not present the problem as "we had a rough show." He presented it as one more example of a larger pattern. According to Perkins, Stephen A. did not really stand with him after that moment. He did not pull him close and say, "I got you." He did not move like someone protecting a teammate after a major public blow-up. Instead, Perkins says that same incident was later used against him behind the scenes. In his telling, it became more proof for Stephen A. to show executives that Perkins was risky, loud, unpredictable, and bad for the network. Whether someone believes that or not, it fits the bigger argument Perkins is now making. His point is that Stephen A. knew how to work both sides. In public, he could act like a partner. Behind the scenes, he could paint a very different picture. And according to Perkins, that pattern did not stop with the J.J. Redick blow-up. He says it kept happening, debate after debate, show after show. If Perkins strongly challenged Stephen A., if he publicly undercut one of Stephen A.'s takes, or if he refused to just play the role of supporting voice, then the consequences behind the scenes would start to show. Maybe not in one giant move, maybe not in one dramatic meeting, but through whispers, comments, and reputation hits. Another example Perkins has talked about involves the Christmas Day NBA schedule debate in 2025. That might sound small to some people, but in sports TV, little debates can tell you a lot about bigger relationships. Stephen A. argued that the way the schedule was set up showed a lack of respect for the Eastern Conference. Perkins pushed back hard.
He said the NBA was simply making the best business choice. He pointed out where the big stars were. He argued that if the league wanted the biggest audience on a day when it was also competing with football, it had to put the most famous names and the strongest draw on the screen. That was his position, and he broke it down with confidence. Now, on the surface, that sounds normal. Two analysts disagreeing over TV programming and league marketing. Nothing strange there. But in Perkins' version of events, the real issue was not the debate itself. It was that Stephen A. did not like being publicly broken down that way, especially by someone he may have seen as a person he helped create. Perkins has strongly suggested that when he started beating Stephen A. on certain points, or at least started pushing back in ways that made Stephen A. look weaker, the relationship got worse. That is an important part of this whole thing. Perkins is not just saying, we disagreed. He's saying, once I stopped playing a certain role, I became a target. Then there was the moment where Stephen A. went on one of his most pointed on-air rants about Perkins himself. This is one of the clearest examples because the video is right there. Stephen A. said he was not really disagreeing with Perkins from a basketball view, but that Perkins was annoying him that day. That sentence alone changed the feel of the moment, because once you say you were not even arguing the basketball point anymore, and instead you were talking about how much a person is annoying you, it becomes personal. That is not a sports argument. That is a man showing irritation with another man. And then Stephen A. kept going. He brought up Perkins' NBA past. He brought up being a champion. And then he took it to the moment Perkins probably never wanted thrown in his face on television. He brought up the 2010 NBA Finals Game 7 injury. He brought up the fact that Perkins did not play in that game. That's a painful topic. Celtics fans still talk about what might have happened if Perkins had been healthy. Perkins himself has spoken over the years about how badly that loss hurt him. So when
It was a way of saying you are not in a position to speak on this because of the worst timing of your career. That kind of shot stays with people. Perkins clearly did not forget it, and when he talks now about Stephen A.'s behavior, moments like that seem to sit at the center of his anger. Not because they were loud, not because they went viral, but because they revealed something about how far Stephen A. was willing to go when he was upset. Perkins' argument is that Stephen A. wanted control, and once that control felt threatened, he would use whatever angle worked best. Sometimes that meant smiling and acting supportive. Sometimes that meant going behind the scenes. Sometimes it meant turning a live TV disagreement into a deeply personal attack. That is the picture Perkins is painting. The Charles Barkley situation in 2025 added even more fuel to all of this. Barkley went after Perkins publicly, calling him names and mocking his Lakers takes. Perkins fired back on social media and made it clear he was not going to sit quietly while Barkley talked about him that way. Stephen A., at least in public, appeared to support Perkins. He posted online, telling Barkley to stop speaking vaguely and to say the name directly. To many viewers, that looked like support. It looked like Stephen A. backing up a colleague. But Perkins now says the public side and the private side were two different worlds. He says that while Stephen A. looked supportive in public, he was telling executives behind the scenes that this was yet another example of Perkins being a problem. That is such a key part of Perkins' story. He keeps returning to the same idea. Publicly one thing, privately another. A colleague on camera, a critic in meetings, support on social media, damage in executive talks. If Perkins is right, then what he is describing is not a one-time issue or one bad misunderstanding. He is describing a full system of behavior. A system where someone with real power keeps their hands clean in front of the audience, but works quietly to shape outcomes when the cameras are off. That is why his story has hit so hard with a lot of people. Because even outside sports media, many people know what it feels like to deal with someone who smiles in public and undercuts you in private. Then came another issue that Perkins has pointed to as proof of a double standard inside ESPN, the Papaya gaming situation. According to reports around that time, on-air talent were told to cut ties with the app because the network believed it created a conflict issue. Perkins says he and others were expected to comply, but he also says Stephen A. had done promotion tied to the same app and did not face the same kind of trouble. Whether every detail of that situation is exactly as Perkins sees it or not, the important thing is how Perkins experienced it. To him, it was one more example of there being one set of rules for Stephen A. and another for everybody else. And once someone starts seeing a pattern like that, every new situation begins to fit into the same larger story. By the start of 2026, things had clearly reached a different stage. Rumors started flying that Perkins was out at ESPN. Social media accounts pushed it, fake reports spread, clickbait headlines made it look like a firing had already happened. Suddenly, fans were talking about it like it was done. And this is where Perkins did something that changed the energy of the situation. Instead of hiding from the noise, he faced it. He spoke directly. He said that if ESPN fired him today, he would lose no sleep because someone in Boston would hire him. That was not just a statement about another job. That was a statement about dignity. It was a statement that said, I'm not going to sit here afraid. I'm not going to beg to stay in a place where I think somebody is trying to bury me. That line hit hard because of what it suggested underneath. Perkins was basically saying he knew what might be happening, and he was no longer scared to talk about it. He was also telling Stephen A., without saying his name directly in that moment, that he would not accept a version of the story where Stephen A. could act like he owned his career. Perkins was saying, you may have helped me once, but you do not control where I end up. That is a powerful thing to say when you are talking about a place where one personality is believed to have huge influence. It was also a very public refusal to be quiet. After that, Perkins
talked about how some people are protected and some are not. He talked about how the same contract that once felt like a blessing later started to feel like part of a trap. That is a very important emotional part of this story. Perkins is not just saying someone tried to hurt him, he is also saying that something he once viewed as proof of support later looked more like proof that he had been placed in a position where somebody else expected loyalty in return. If you lay out the timeline the way Perkins sees it, it becomes easy to understand why he uses such strong language now. First, Stephen A. helps get him the bigger deal. Then, over time, on-air debates get more personal. Then, according to Perkins, the private criticism starts. Then, public support and private damage begin happening at the same time. Then, rumors about his exit start spinning. Then, Perkins hears enough, sees enough, or is told enough to feel sure that this is not random. That is the path he is asking people to see. And whether people fully buy every piece of it or not, it is a serious charge because it speaks to the structure of power at a giant network, not just one bad personal relationship. One of the most striking parts of this whole thing is the irony Perkins points out. While Stephen A. was allegedly trying to push him out or damage his standing, Perkins remained at ESPN. Reports of his firing were debunked. His profile still showed him as part of the network. He was named to NBA Countdown as part of the show's new look. Stephen A., meanwhile, had stepped away from NBA Countdown during his own contract talks, saying he did not want to be on the show. So the person Perkins says was trying to move him out of the picture ended up not being the one on that particular set, while Perkins stayed visible. For Perkins, that feels like proof that the campaign against him did not fully work. And that is probably the biggest reason this story has gotten so much attention. Perkins did not disappear. He did not quietly fade away. He did not become one more media name who got pushed aside and replaced. He stayed. He kept working. He kept talking. He kept his side of the story alive. That matters because in industries built on access and relationships, many people choose silence when somebody powerful turns against them. Perkins went the other way. He decided to talk more. He decided to show that he was not afraid of what that might mean. And in doing that, he turned himself from a possible cautionary tale into something else entirely. He turned himself into a man publicly challenging one of the most powerful people in sports TV. There is also a deeper reason this story feels bigger than just two men not liking each other. It touches a nerve because people know how power works. They know what it means when one person becomes so important to an organization that others start working around that person's moods, views, and private opinions. They know what it means when some people seem untouchable while others feel replaceable. Perkins is tapping into that feeling. He is telling a story that says the biggest battles are not always the loud debates the audience sees. Sometimes the real battle is in who gets called into meetings, who gets defended privately, who gets criticized privately, and who gets treated like a problem that needs to be managed. That is why this is not really just about ESPN gossip. It is about something larger. It is about what happens when media power stops being just about who talks the loudest on screen and becomes about who can shape careers behind the scenes. Perkins is basically accusing Stephen A. of playing both games at once. One game in public, where everything looks like entertainment. Another game in private, where reputations are built or damaged with quiet conversations. If true, that changes how people might watch every future exchange between them. Because then the audience is not just watching debate, they are watching a power struggle dressed up as debate. At the same time, it is only fair to say that these are Perkins's claims and his interpretation of events. Stephen A. is still one of the biggest names in the business. He still has his platform, he still has his influence. He has not admitted to any secret campaign to get Perkins fired. And ESPN as a company has not come out with.
Perkins is saying that is not true. He is saying that after the segment ends, there is another level to the fight. There are calls, comments, executive talks, and positioning moves. There are people protecting themselves and trying to shape outcomes. If that is even partly true, then the way fans watch sports debate shows has to change. They cannot assume every loud argument is just about sports. Sometimes it may be about status. Sometimes it may be about control. Sometimes it may be about one person trying to make sure another person never becomes too strong. That idea becomes even more interesting when you think about how First Take and similar shows are built. These programs need conflict. They need strong personalities. They need people willing to disagree in ways that feel real enough to grab attention. But what happens when the biggest personality on the show also has enough power to affect who else gets to stay in the building? That is the question sitting in the middle of Perkins' entire story. He is not just mad about being insulted. He is raising a bigger issue. Can there be fair competition between voices on air if one of those voices also has so much power off air? That is a serious question, and it goes far beyond just one network. What makes Perkins' story hit even harder is the emotional side of it. He is not telling this story like a man just upset about a lost argument. He is telling it like someone who feels deeply betrayed. Someone who looked at a person as an ally, maybe even as a reason his second career got going, and later came to believe that same person had been quietly working against him. That kind of betrayal feels different than a normal workplace conflict. It changes how you look back at everything. The contract help, the public smiles, the support on social media, the shared set, all of it begins to feel different if you believe the person on the other side never really wanted your success unless it stayed inside limits they controlled. And in the end, that may be why so many people connected to this story so fast. Even people who do not care much about ESPN or First Take can understand that feeling. The feeling of realizing that someone who once helped you may have helped you for reasons that had little to do with your well-being. The feeling of learning that somebody wanted your loyalty more than your growth. The feeling of seeing that the same hand that lifted you up may also have been ready to push you down the moment you stopped being useful in the right way. Perkins is telling that kind of story. That is why it feels personal. That is why it feels bigger than sports debate television. As of now, Kendrick Perkins is still there. He is still part of ESPN. He was not officially fired. The rumors were wrong. The fake reports were wrong. Stephen A. Smith is still there too, still huge, still powerful, still at the center of the sports talk world. But something has changed. Whether Stephen A. likes it or not, Perkins has now put this idea out into the public in a major way. He has told people that the performance they watch every day may hide a very different reality. He has told people to stop assuming that the loudest debate on screen is the whole battle. He has said the real battle may happen when the cameras stop. And once viewers hear that, they cannot fully unhear it. So now, whenever those two men sit across from each other again and argue about LeBron, about MVP, about a playoff matchup, or about whatever topic fills the show that day, the audience will see more than just basketball takes. They will see history. They will see tension. They will see the possibility that one man once helped create a platform for the other and later wanted to pull that platform away. They will see what Perkins wants them to see, that the biggest fight might not be the one spoken into the microphone. It might be the silent one underneath it all. And if Kendrick Perkins is telling the truth, then this story is not just about being exposed. It is about survival. It is about a man refusing to let somebody else write the final version of his career story for him. It is about saying, you do not get to smile in my face, whisper behind my back, and think I will stay quiet. That is why this whole thing matters. Not because it is messy, not because it is dramatic, but because it pulls the curtain back on how power may really move in sports television. Kendrick Perkins says he got the call. He says he learned the truth. He says he saw how the game was being played, and instead of walking away quietly, he chose to talk. He chose to name the pattern. He chose to stand in the middle of the noise and say that what people think they know about Stephen A. Smith may not be the full story. Whether people believe every word or not, that choice alone changed the conversation. Because once someone inside the machine starts describing how the machine works, the audience stops watching the same way.